Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, February 23rd, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week we go to the International Mead Festival, recently held in Boulder, Colorado, with our field correspondent, Brian Warren, otherwise known as Brian from Inglewood in previous podcasts. Brian attended the Mead Festival for us and recorded some great interviews with mead makers from this country and around the world. It's going to be a long show today, but I wanted to sneak in a quick soundbite from a brew day that my buddy Steve Wilkes and I had recently. When I got there, Steve was bottling an Amarillo ale, sampling a peach beer that he's talked about on this program before, and racking another ale into the fermenter.
I started with a very traditional British bitter, a light bitter. 5 pounds of British two-row, I think, and 8 ounces of British crystal, and then what else?
Hops and
honey and
molasses and
all kinds of stuff. We put. I couldn't remember the hops for a moment, but it was Kent Goldings, and I used a ounce at the boil, a half ounce for flavor, and a half ounce for finishing hops. And then I used a pound of raw honey from an unlabeled farm in northwest Arkansas. I'm not sure where the farm is, but it's a pound of raw honey, and it was a real heavy honey. Heavy honey?
Mm-hmm.
And then 3/4 of a cup of blackstrap molasses. And so those were my two adjuncts.
And the unfermented wort tasted great.
Tasted very good. I could have drank it right then.
And then we tried your peach ale.
The peach ale.
Which actually people have been writing to me about.
Mm-hmm.
How's the peach ale coming?
It's coming along pretty good.
That is, this summer that beer is going to be so it's wonderful now, but it's kind of cold outside. When it's hot outside, when it's like 100 degrees outside, and we're sitting on the patio, drinking some of this peach ale.
Yep.
Oh.
We'll have the grill fired up. We'll have some barbecue for dessert. We'll grill some pineapple, some kind of fruit thing, and we'll have a peach ale.
And it was wonderful. It was light, and it would be the perfect beer companion to the Amarillo ale.
Yeah.
Because the Amarillo, you've got the citrus going on. With the peach, you've got the peachy fruitiness going on. Both those tart flavors, light, both of them.
Yep.
But wonderful, well-balanced, excellent beers.
Thanks, James. Well, the peach ale I made as an extract, the one that we were talking about, which is great. I used 5 pounds of light malt extract, 1 pound of amber malt extract, and the next time I do this, which I am going to do it again, I'm going to do an all-grain brew. And I'll have to do it in the summer. It'll have to be about August because that's when the peaches come in here in Arkansas.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll use Arkansas peaches, and we'll do it fresh. But on this ale, I put the peaches in the primary fermenter and pasteurize them in the primary. The next time I do it, I'm going to follow some advice I've received from good friends, Chris Milam to be exact, about doing it in the secondary. So I'll do it in the secondary next time. We'll have a little different brew, but, along about Christmas when you're eating peach pie, we'll have a little peach ale to go with it.
And you know what? This summer, I made this comment kind of half-heartedly joking, but I said, this beer would go real well with a dollop of ice cream in it.
And you know what? As soon as you said that, I went, yeah, that's a pretty damn good idea.
So this summer, we're going to have peach beer ice cream floats.
Peach floats.
We're going to do it.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right.
So that was a lot of fun. We also sampled a barley wine from California, courtesy of Rick Sellers of Pacific Brew News Radio, by the way, and some La Folie. That's a sour beer, a Belgian sour beer from New Belgium Brewery in Colorado. Awesome stuff, both of those beers. And speaking of Colorado, let's get to our chat with Brian Warren, who covered the International Mead Festival in Boulder a couple of weeks ago. Well, Brian Warren, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Well, thanks, James. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Well, and you are in a historic position. You are our first man in the field. You're our first field reporter. How does that feel?
Well, it feels great. It was kind of fun being out there on the field. I was wearing my Basic Brewing Radio T-shirt, and I got lots of comments. Some people had heard of the podcast before, and other people were wondering what it was. I imagine you might even be getting some new listeners from this.
Well, great. We're glad to have them. And I understand you accessorized your Basic Brewing T-shirt rather well.
I did. I wore a kilt, and some people asked if that was standard fare for field reporters for Basic Brewing. And I told them this was a bit of an experiment, so I wasn't sure yet.
Well, I don't have the legs for a kilt, so I don't think people should look for me out there with the kilt.
Well, they're a good way to get a tan.
And good aeration, I guess.
Yes.
Good ventilation, I guess you'd say.
Not hot side aeration, though.
I'll leave that one alone. So what were your general impressions of the Mead Festival?
Well, it was pretty interesting. I mean, the last fermentable festival that I went to was the Great American Beer Festival, and that was just huge. I mean, there's thousands of beers there, and this was quite a bit smaller. It was held in a hotel in Boulder, and it was kind of this quirky little hotel, but it was still pretty big. I mean, there were at least 100 or so meads there, and I'm not good at guessing how many numbers of participants there were, but there were several hundred people there, and it was just really neat. I mean, everybody was real down to earth. I mean, it was just mellow, and it was fun. They had music playing, and it was really neat. And there were lots of really good meads to taste, that's for sure.
So do you have favorites?
Oh, man. I got to try all of the meads from Redstone Meadery in Boulder, and they had some real treats. They had a juniper mead that was really delicious. Tasted a little gin-like, but I don't know. For most of the meads that I really, really liked were some of the drier ones. But some of the sweeter ones I enjoyed were, there was the Polish meads. There were some Polish mead makers there who won some awards, and they had some delicious meads that were, they were pouring them out of these handmade mead bottles that they had made themselves, and it was just a really neat experience.
So have you made a mead? You're a home brewer, but have you made a mead?
I've made one batch of mead, and it was delicious. So I'll be making more.
What was your recipe like?
It was pretty basic. It was 2 gallons of honey that was from bees here in Colorado, and the rest was, of course, water. And then we put a little bit of grape tannins, I believe, in it, and then also a little bit of orange peel, and maybe a little bit of spices, too. I made it with a buddy of mine, and it was delicious. So
did you learn anything you got to talk to some brewers. Did you learn anything from the brewers that will help you in making your next batch of mead?
Most of the brewers that I talked to, I asked them about pasteurization, and we'll get to that in a couple of the interviews, but most of the ones I talked to said they don't pasteurize, so I probably won't be doing that in the future. And the one thing that I learned the most of was experiment. I mean, everybody was really just into just trying different things, keeping track of what you do, of course, but people were pretty adventurous. One guy I talked to, he makes a chili mead, and that's pretty wild. He actually said he doesn't like it, but people were trying all sorts of different things, and so yeah, I want to get a little more adventurous, because I mean, a little bit of orange peel doesn't sound as exciting as chili, so I don't know.
Now, it seems to me that the one rule that I heard talked about the most was, of course, sanitization, and making sure that you have clean equipment, and the same with beer making. That's the main rule, and as long as you stay within that, you can play around with the ingredients. It sounds like mead may be even more open to adventure and experimentation than beer.
It really seems like it, James. I mean, people, they get a little worried about trying different things with beer or mead, and the thing I always tell people is it's really hard to ruin it. And I'd say even to the greater extent with mead, it just seems like it's really hard to make a bad mead. And as long as, really the only thing that people seem to be worried about is make sure you're clean about it. And so it almost might be even more open to that experimentation for sure.
Now, people take different tacts to mead making, kind of like making beer, but it seemed from this sample of interviews, even more kind of extremes within the range of attitudes. You've got the uber mead geeks who, concentrate on the technical side. And then you've got people like Vince Carlson, who you talk to. Tell us about Vince.
Well, Vince, he's quite a character. Vince is he's a mead maker from Woodinville, Washington, and he keeps his own bees, as you'll hear, and it's just him and his wife doing their own thing there, and he kind of does take a little bit more of the spiritual, more earthy aspect to it, and but yeah, he's a real fun guy to talk to.
I started out brewing beer. And one day I was up in the mountains at a brewer's party. We're sitting around the bonfire and everybody's sharing kegs and bottles and all the different kinds of creations they'd mustered from the cellar. And one of my colleagues came up to me and handed me this glass of liquid that looked like piss. I wasn't certain what he had gotten it from or what it was, and I asked him, and he said it was mead. I said, mead? What is mead? He said, mead's fermented honey. It's honey wine. I said, you can do that? I took a sip of it, and this whole energy took over my body. It was like seeing the Lord. It was like a light. And I realized that my Swedish heritage that I always thought was somewhat the ugly duckling was revived. The Viking blood was fed on mead. And ever since, I've been making mead, and now I have a commercial meadery. I make some of the most sacred meads there are, and I've devoted, it's a passion. People ask me, well, what goes good with mead? Naked women. There's a great place. I make a wonderful beer. I have beer in the fridge all the time, my home brew. That's all I drink. But sometimes, it's filling and fattening, and if you're going to drink as much as I do, you need something that you can consistently pull open every night and quaff. Mead's definitely the one for that. And if you're interested in getting into mead, I think, technically it's very simple. I think to make a good mead, you focus on the more spiritual end of it. And when I say that, I mean get to know your local beekeeper. Know where you get your honey from. Don't just go to the Costco and buy a box of honey. Really get to know your honey, where it came from. I use kegs to gather artesian spring water. Water's important. You don't want chlorine in your mead. You don't want fluoride in your mead. So those are really important. And any brew maker knows cleanliness and sterilization is the key to a successful fermentation.
Do you when you get your honey, do you pasteurize it or do you heat it up at all, or you just take it straight?
There's a lot of there are two different schools of thought on that, and I can appreciate that. I do not heat my honey. I think honey is a very sacred and delicate thing, and I heat my water up to get it sterilized, and I cool it down, and I heat it up enough to melt the honey, to let it liquefy, but I wouldn't want to threaten it with boiling.
Yeah.
But if you read some of the ancient old archives of mead making, they boiled and boiled till it was then 2/3 of what it was,
Wow.
So I would encourage you to experiment and learn.
Cool. And you actually referred to it as making potions for people.
It truly is. This is an elderflower that we're trying today, and there was a pleasant country belief that if the flowers were put into ale and a man and woman drank it together, they would be married within a year. And I can tell you some personal stories about drinking elderberry wine. So yeah, it definitely has some psychotropic values, depending on, there's people here adding cinnamon and nutmeg and all kinds of things to their elixir.
Well, I appreciate you talking with us and giving us your more spiritual background on the mead. That's great.
Now, Vince he's definitely out there.
Yeah, he is. He's a wild guy.
But, you can tell he's passionate about making the mead, and I bet he makes some really good meads.
He does. His meads tend to be on the drier side. He didn't really bring any sweet meads with him. and they were actually the first ones I tried at the fest, and they were delicious. He does good work.
Now we go from the kind of spiritual aspects of mead making to the more of the practical aspects, especially for our homebrewing listeners with the interview you did with Mark Barron. Tell us about Mark.
Well, Mark, he runs a pretty small operation. He's from Medavina, which is the name of his mead company, and he also keeps his own bees. And he's a real down-to-earth guy. They only do, I think, about 3,000 bottles a year, so a really, really small operation as far as commercial mead making goes. But he's a really cool guy, and really, really enjoyed just talking to him. And he was a home brewer for a really long time, so he's got a good perspective from the side of home brewers.
We are a small boutique meadery. We produce about 3,000 bottles a year, and I guess what's really unique about our meads is that we produce our own honey, so it's all a local product. And we really try and go out of the box and produce some real creative meads that are different for people to try. Most of our meads are on the drier side, although we do make one dessert mead. And we also make a line of fruit meads. And what we like to do is feature just the nuance or the essence of the fruit without having it in your face.
So we got the lucky opportunity to try some of your peach mead. And you were saying that you basically take the seed out and just toss the whole peach in, right?
Yes. Cut it in half, take the seed out and throw it in, and leave it in for a long time. Just keep tasting it, and when you get the right balance, you just take it off the peaches. And usually that's several months.
At what point during the mead making process do you put it in? Do you put it in way at the end or towards the beginning?
Towards the beginning, or even at the beginning, but it depends on. I've done it all different ways, and I seem to be stabilizing pretty close to the beginning. I like to get the yeast started with as little competition as possible in the beginning, but once I know things are going good, I throw the peaches in.
All right, awesome. So soon after pitching, once you notice that things are really churning, and then toss it in.
I mean, if you think about it, in a few days you can get to 5% alcohol, and once you're at 5% alcohol, it's a lot safer to add something in that maybe isn't pasteurized. And I'm using fresh peaches or sometimes frozen peaches, and so that's anytime after that is a safe time to add it in. So a few days, a week, 2 weeks, and then you can leave it in until you think it has enough peach character.
And then you just take it out? I mean, how would...
You rack it off the peaches. And peaches are kind of a mess because what inevitably happens is some of the peaches will fall to the bottom and the rest of them will stay right on the top, and what you want is in the middle. So it's a little tricky, but you just do it often enough, and you do sacrifice a little bit of mead. But usually what I do is at the very end, when I have this humongous peach mass, I'll just put that aside in a 5-gallon carboy, and after a month or so, it'll start to separate, and I'll be able to pull off a couple gallons of mead that I just keep for myself.
Oh, nice.
So I try not to waste any of it.
So you were a home brewer and home mead maker for a long time before you started doing it commercially?
About 8 years. And when I did my first batch of mead, I was like totally hooked. It's like the next month I already did my second batch, and then a couple months later I did my third batch, and I did about a batch every 3 months for 8 years. And people started knowing that I was doing mead. I'd bring it to parties and stuff, and I knew things had changed when I showed up at a party and I didn't bring any mead. Kind of an oversight, and they really said, "You're not getting in the door without the mead. You don't understand." So I really had to go home and get the mead.
You kind of start wondering why you're actually invited to the parties in the first place.
Exactly. Well, I just used it. I said this is a commercial opportunity here, so that's when I decided to go commercial. And that was about 3.5 years ago.
So to the average home brewer who's maybe thinking about mead, or maybe he's done 1 or 2 batches, what kind of advice would you give to them, given your years of experience?
Well, first of all, I would say absolutely don't be afraid of making mead, because the process is simpler than making beer, especially if you're doing extract, the full grain extracting. So number one, don't be afraid of it. It only takes a couple hours to make a batch. Focus on sanitation. And beyond that, also don't be afraid to experiment. Like if you have a flavor on your palate that you like or a combination that you know you like, just translate it into mead and experiment a little bit, and you'll probably come up with something. Be very patient that you'll really like. And then if it isn't what you want, make small adjustments. Just do a small adjustment, wait a month, see what it tastes like, do another small adjustment until you get it where you want it. I mean, we start out with honey, which is it's nature's perfect food. It never spoils. It can be 3,000 years old and it's still honey. So our job as mead makers is just not to ruin this perfect thing. So we need to treat it with respect and very delicately. And if you do that, you can make wonderful, wonderful meads as homebrew. I mean, you don't have to think that it's going to be a compromise relative to the commercial. It's actually the other way around, because as a commercial meadery, you're subject to guidelines that you have to meet. And as a homebrew, you can do whatever you want. And it can be every bit as good or even better.
Awesome. Well, I know personally, like, a couple of things that made me not want to make mead in the first place were, number one, it kind of takes a lot of time, and then the other one is honey's kind of expensive. So any advice to kind of a couple of those types of things?
Well, I have a solution to the first part. I mean, the patience is a problem, and if you're used to the beer cycle, it's going to be a problem. But if you make a 5-gallon batch every 3 months, after the first year, you'll have stuff in the pipeline, and then you can be drinking mead, and you'll never notice again that it's taking a year for your mead to get done. So just fill the pipeline and keep making mead, and now you really have a new mead that you can try every 3 months. So that's a reasonable cycle. And what was the other question you asked?
It was the cost thing.
The cost. Well, that is an issue. I mean, you can have your own bees, but if you don't want to go that route, then I would suggest getting in touch with local beekeepers and find beekeepers that are doing a real natural honey where they're not heating it when they're processing it. And if you buy 5 gallons at a time, you can negotiate a pretty good price. I mean, you can essentially buy it at wholesale. And that 5-gallon batch of honey will probably do 3 or 4 batches of mead. And so when you amortize it out, it's really not that bad. I mean, it is an expensive form of sugar, but given the effort and the cost of making it, the price is really pretty reasonable. Because I wish I could just buy the honey. I enjoy the beekeeping, but it's a lot of work. But I know if I buy the honey, I'm going to have a different product. So I'm forced to do what I enjoy doing, but when you're doing a ton of honey a year, it gets to be a lot of work. Yeah, more of a job at that point than just a fun hobby.
So what were some of the first kind of experimental things that you did? Did you ever have any that turned out horribly or anything, or has it all been just successful?
Actually, I've never had any that were horrible. In fact, I've never really had any that I didn't drink, and I did some really crazy things as experiments. Like one time I said, I'm going to break every rule. So I made a must. I forget, it was probably pretty average starting bricks, maybe 25% honey. And I just took a package of dry yeast, which was a red wine yeast, which shouldn't have worked with mead. And I just poured the packet in the 1-gallon jar, put an airlock on it, and I put it in my cellar. And I literally forgot about it for a year and a half. And so I never racked it, I never looked at it, and I never even knew if it started to ferment. But a year and a half later, when I found it, I was wondering what it was, and it was nice and clear, and it had a real thick layer of leaves on the bottom. And I said, well, I should just rack it off the leaves and bottle it and see what it tastes like. It was really good. It was a really nice, dry, and it had that red wine character because of the yeast. So that proved to me that if you're careful about what you do in terms of sanitation and you use good ingredients, things are going to work out pretty well. I mean, that was kind of extreme. The temperature was 55 degrees in the cellar, so everything was wrong about what I did, and it still turned out okay. So that was probably my most off-the-wall experiment.
Really, the only controversial topic I know about in the mead making stuff is, do you heat up your honey or before? Do you heat it up to sanitize it or not?
I don't pasteurize it. So the heating it up, it's kind of, I have to say to like every home brewer, you have to make a judgment call. Like the more you know about your honey. Well, first of all, honey doesn't like to grow bacteria, and that's why it's so stable after 3,000 years in the Egyptian pyramids. It's still honey. So yeah, it's so high in sugar concentration that it has this osmotic pressure that doesn't allow organisms to penetrate and live in it. It also, some of the sucrose, when it's converted enzymatically by the bees, some of it is glucose and fructose, which are the main single carbon sugars or 6 carbon sugars that come from the sucrose. But also some of that glucose gets converted by an enzyme to gluconic acid and hydrogen peroxide. And that gives honey its acidity, which also organisms don't like an acidic environment. And the hydrogen peroxide is a disinfectant, and it's like 0.2%, but it's enough to make the honey not very desirable. So if you know your honey has been well cared for and not stored for a long time in an environment which maybe could pick up bacteria, I would heat the honey only enough to get it to the point where you can work with it. And you will be fine. And then think about having a very healthy yeast. Make sure your yeast has proper nutrition. Make sure you don't temperature shock it. Make sure you don't sugar shock it. Take really good care of it, and it's very competitive. It will go in there, and if there are bits of organisms that maybe might want to start to grow because now you reduced the sugar concentration when you made your must, the yeast is very competitive. It'll just go in there and take care of it. So unless you like the character of a boiled, the first mead I ever made was boiled, and I actually just opened a bottle of it last night, and I hadn't tasted it in probably 6 years, and it was wonderful. But I remember the first several years, it was kind of medicinal in tasting, and I didn't love it. And I think the more heat you use, the longer it will take your mead to be enjoyable. So, and even that one didn't have a lot of like boiled honey or heated character to it, but after 12 years, it was awesome. But that's a long time to wait.
Yeah.
So you really have to be patient to wait out a mead for 12 years.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Mark, he does seem like a really patient guy when you talk to him, and just more of that down-to-earth kind of vibe you get from talking to him. He's just a really pleasant guy, and he really, really enjoys what he does.
And again, Mark and Vince both say they don't pasteurize their meads or pasteurize the honey. And David Myers, who we talked to a few weeks ago, said that he does.
Uh-huh.
But it seems like everybody says, make your own judgment call and do what you feel feel like you've got to do.
That's definitely true. I mean, having tasted all of those guys' mead, right in succession, I can say they all make very, very good stuff. And and it's kind of like beer brewing too. I mean, we talked on your sanitization show about, do what you feel comfortable with, because this is all about you enjoying the process, and the results speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm. If you did a procedure and it turned out well, then that was the right thing to do, at least in that batch.
Yeah, it's like wearing your same pair of socks for the whole World Series.
Do you have brewing socks or a brewing
kilt?
No,
I don't. Yeah, I think I've worn different clothes on all of my brew sessions.
Now, Michael Fall is someone who also started out as a home brewer, but has, I guess, a kind of a mead success story.
Definitely. Michael, excuse me. He's doing really well with his mead making. He's got a pretty decent success story for sure. I mean, he actually won, I believe, a handful of awards at this festival, mostly for his sizers, which he'll talk about. But he's doing really well, and he's made quite a success. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners would like to be in his shoes right now.
Do you call it brewing if you're making mead? Some people call it
venting, right, like wine, and some people call it brewing. We actually call it just mead making. We started probably 1987. My wife, on a trip to Ireland, she bought a bottle of mead, came home from Ireland, loved it, couldn't find any more. So as a home brewer, she asked me if I could make mead, and I said, sure, it's just honey and water. All right, so, we made a couple of batches of mead. She liked them. All of her friends liked them. Next thing you know, I'm making the legal limit in my garage, 200 gallons a year, giving it all away. And then somebody asked me if they could buy some, and I said, well, no, I can't sell it to you, but let me go investigate what it takes to go sell it. So in 1994, we got our permit to actually manufacture wine, because that's what it's classified as. And so I started in 94, been doing it in my garage until 2000, making several hundred gallons a year, kind of working through a bunch of different recipes and formulas. And then in 2000, we went commercial and moved from one small building into another bigger building, and now we're moving into another bigger building this year. So things are growing.
So that's like a home brewer's dream. I mean, everybody making their own beer, they're kind of like, well, if I could sell this stuff, if I could actually get paid to brew my own beer or make my own mead, that would just be the best thing ever.
Right. Well, the key is basically to sell enough of it to pay all the bills that come with starting the company. So, what we did was we put together a business plan that basically said, here's the 5-year projection to break even. Right, and so we've been fortunate enough to actually break even about a year and a half early. So things are going okay.
How did you find people to sell it to?
Talking to people that I know, talking to people that I don't know, just going to events and fairs, and just basically preaching to people what mead is, right? It's a huge education process, right? Very, very limited numbers of people in the country, anyway, in the United States, know what mead is. So you have to re-educate them. You make something that is, good enough for everybody. And then, some people will like it, obviously, some people won't. And then you've got the middle of the road people that will like pretty much anything you make, regardless. And those are sort of the people that you want to go and spread the word for you. So it's very organic. Right? You get one customer, they tell somebody else, and then they tell a friend, and then the next thing you know, you've got 10 customers.
So tell me about a couple of the different meads that you make and that you brought to the event today.
So we've actually brought 8 different products with us to the event this year. Every year we bring our dry mead, which is a barrel-aged dry mead, so single varietal honey. So it's made with a raspberry honey from Oregon. It's really dry, really oaky. A bunch of cowboys in Santa Maria in California think it's bourbon, but it's not. We have our sweet mead, which is again another single varietal. This is made with a jasmine honey from Oregon, and we bring that every year. And what's really weird about this particular product is it tastes different every year. So you get different flows of honey, and every year it's different, just because of the bees are different, the amount of rainfall is different, but it's a unique way to kind of say mead is just like regular wine, right? Because it has all of the same variances of different crops and harvest from year to year. And then the last mead festival in 2004, we actually introduced our first sizer, and it was quite a big hit, and it was actually a little bit of a shock how much people actually liked it, and demand was pretty high for it after the show. And then what we decided was to early release of the other apple sizers that we made, which are the hard lemonade, a black cherry, and a peach as well.
So some people listening to this may not know what a sizer is. Can you just give them a briefing?
So sizer is an apple and honey wine, technically, right? So typically 50% honey, 50% apple juice. What we've done is we've taken a little bit of liberty and added some other fruit juices to the end of it, right? So now you've got apple sizers that are flavored with different fruit juices. So what we've done is we've taken something that's got a little bit more mass market appeal, and instead of using the existing the Rabbit's Foot Meadery brand, we've decided that because they're so similar to typical or traditional hard ciders, we would call them ciders instead. So people understand what cider is, don't have to re-educate those people, and so we've got the Red Branch Cider Company product.
So if a home brewer wanted to make their own sizer, can they just pick up a bottle of apple juice and go from there? Do you actually, grind up the apples and make your own apple juice to do that too?
So typically you wouldn't just go buy a bottle of apple juice and ferment it because it doesn't have the right blend of apples, right? Typically what you're looking for are apples in specific categories that are designed for cider making, right? Bitter sharp, bitter sweets, more tannic types of apples like crab apples, etc. And then you also want to put in the right type of honey. If you have access to an apple tree, an old crab apple tree in your backyard, you could take the crab apples, take some pippins, crush them, press the juice, and then just mix it with your favorite honey and make a sizer. So yeah, the home brewer could do it, but don't do it with jars of apple juice from the store.
Well, that's good to know. I don't want people out there, thinking they can make their own sizer out of stuff they find at Walmart. So, well, that's awesome. Did you guys invent the whole sizer thing, or has it been around for years and nobody knew about it, or what was the deal there?
Well, Sizer's been around as long as Mead has been around. I mean, historically, if you go back and look in, medieval documents, you'll find reference to Sizer. I mean, there's a couple of different opinions as to where it came from and why it was produced. But a lot of times, what you'll have is people have larger crops of honey one year, they have smaller crops of apples in that same year, and what they end up doing is they end up blending those two things together so they can make a consistent product that may be a higher alcohol content. Years where you've got lower production of apple juice, you want to fortify that with some honey, and the same thing goes in the reverse. So the little research I've done, I mean, it's been around for hundreds of years. It's just I think I've come on it in a little different frame of mind or point of view than some other people might have.
So sizers, they sound really fun, and it's interesting that Michael, because of the kind of education process that they're having to deal with the public, they can't call them sizers, which is what they really are. They have to call them ciders.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I mean, he actually his group goes by two different names. There's the Rabbit's Foot Meadery, and I can't remember what the name of his cider company is, but they actually do separate it into the meadery and the cider company, I think partly for that reason. But he's had a lot of fun educating the public about what he does. It's pretty cool stuff.
Well, hopefully we can get some traction, and maybe we'll help in educating people about mead and other honey-related beverages, so that they can actually call these things what they are.
Yeah, that would be nice. I mean, with beer, you know what beer is, and to a certain respect, actually, that kind of is a disadvantage too, because I can't count the number of people who've told me, "Oh, well, I don't like beer," and all they've tried is like Michelob Light. And I'm like, well, you should try some of the different kinds of beers. And with mead, it's like there's a little bit of like, huh, what's that? Well, maybe I'll try that, because they don't have any, preconceptions for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of like saying I don't like wine.
Yeah.
Well, wine is such a large range. How can you condemn a whole?
Right. Or I don't like bread. And all you've tried is Wonder Bread.
Yeah. Exactly. Now, you were lucky enough to talk to a mead maker from clear around the world, from, I guess, close to where mead originated, Dr. Garth Cambry. Yeah, Dr. Garth, he just goes by Garth. He almost laughed when I said the word doctor, but he's, when I heard about this guy, one of the other people I was talking to at the Mead Festival said, well, you need to talk to Garth, because he's the mead geek. And so I sought him out. I kind of went back to his booth a couple times, and he wasn't there. And finally I caught him, and he was everything I thought he would be. And just a fascinating guy, and just a real passion for it. And he's a great storyteller too.
The story is quite odd. What happened was when I was in second year, somebody stole my bicycle. And so I was without transport. And so I needed to find a mode of transport, and I started working for a bee professor, cutting up bees and measuring them. And I started realizing that bees were interesting, and I didn't enjoy cutting them up, but maybe if I produced honey, I could get some money. And as soon as I started keeping bees, my parents' gardener started breaking into my beehives and stealing bits and pieces from... And this guy's name was Guru. And I went to Guru and I said, Guru, why do you keep on stealing my beehives? And he said, no, he's making kurica. And I said, well, what's a kurica? And he said, no, he'd take me and take me downtown to the lady that he was giving the honey stuff to make it Critica. And he gave me a glass of this, and I drank it. And then I went to an auction and bought a whole lot of stuff that I didn't want because it made me completely wrecked. And I told my friend, who was my business partner, he passed away last week, I told him this story, and he said, well, why don't you study it? And he was about 5 years ahead of me, and he was my mentor and supervisor. And so we studied the mead, and then in about 2001, he said, well, you've done enough, why don't we build a factory? And then the finishing off the factory can be the completion of your thesis. So last year, we had run the meadery for 3 years, and I was allowed to hand in my thesis. So that was how I got into mead, was because some guy stole my bike. And I dedicated my honors thesis to the person that stole my bike.
Wow, that's wonderful. So you've only really been doing this for 3 years since you started the meadery?
And I've been making some form of mead since 97.
Oh, okay.
I've been making drinkable mead since 99. And I've been making commercial mead since 2001.
Wow.
Yeah. So when you start with mead making, especially if you're using like traditional, as in like seriously traditional techniques like are used by the Xhosa people, your mead comes out looking a little bit like soapy water. And it is viciously powerful, and it has this effect where, if you drink it unwisely on a warm day, you lose feeling in your hands, and it's just deeply disturbing. But I was an undergraduate student, and I was very popular because I'd arrive at a party with 2 drums of this, and everybody would end up sort of in places they weren't supposed to be in, and all sorts of strange, compromising conditions. And as one moves out of being an undergraduate student to being a postgraduate student, you gradually move towards slightly more sophisticated, away from just wanting to be drunk to actually wanting to appreciate the alcohol. And that was what led to the refinement of the mead, was we had to move it away from looking like dishwashing liquid into something that I'm told is reasonably refined. It was served at our president's inauguration, so it can't be bad.
Wow. So tell us more about the traditional fermentation system. I heard a little bit saying that the types of yeasts and stuff that we use as homebrewers and as most mead makers use isn't really how mead making got started hundreds and maybe thousands of years ago. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, if you look at mead making, the yeasts that are in an ancient yeast making culture, people that make a lot of mead, those yeasts tend to be very carefully adapted to honey because they're not used for making wine. Now what's happened, my theory is that people have moved around the world from Africa, where mead was originally made, and they've moved to other areas and they've made wine and they've made beer, and they've taken mead yeasts and they've started making wine and beer with it. And over the last 8,000 years, since people started making beer in Babylon, or wherever it was that they started making beer, that yeast has evolved to become a good yeast, a beer-making yeast, and it stopped being a mead-making yeast. And likewise, the French wine yeasts and so on are not good mead yeasts anymore. So to find a good mead yeast, you have to go right back in time and right back in history to the place where mead evolved, and that is pretty much 600 miles north of where I live.
Wow. So it really is just the different strains and how they haven't needed to evolve into beer making and wine making yeast, and they're still preserved in South Africa?
Well, they've evolved into better and better mead making yeast. So because they've been sitting there, and our continuous fermenter evolves the yeast as it goes, because any yeast that is not adapted to the fermenter washes out, because it can't, and any yeast that is suited to the fermenter stays in there. So in the last 4 years, our yeast has changed noticeably, because we're supplying a constant selection pressure, because any yeast that doesn't stay in the fermenter ends up in the filter. If it ends up in the filter, it ends up in the rubbish bin, and it's out of the equation. So we are evolving rapidly a better and better mead making yeast. And rather than what's happening now, where everybody goes to a lab, they buy yeast, they make the mead, they throw the yeast away, they buy more yeast, they make more mead. And so they are not evolving a mead yeast, they're just using a wine yeast. And what you actually have to do is you have to make 10 batches of mead with the same yeast. And every time subculture the strongest and most vibrant yeast from that, the ones that are still viable at the end of the fermentation, reculture that, make more, And then you'd get a similar system to what we're doing, where we're selecting for ultra-viable mead-making yeast. And I mean, our yeast is serious stuff. We can go up to 15% alcohol in 3 hours with the continuous fermenter, if we do it right. So it is very adapted. We get very limited yeast autolysis, although we do let the yeast that comes out of the fermenter autolyze, because that is part of the traditional African mead taste, is you need a yeastiness. But in the fermenter we get very limited autolysis. We've got very limited alcohol inhibition, and we've got very limited sugar inhibition. So it's this pretty serious yeast.
Wow. So is this something a home brewer could do if they were very careful about sanitization and that sort of thing, and actually keeping their yeasts viable throughout 10 batches and longer, to actually eventually evolve and culture their own yeast to do that?
They would have to use a continuous system, because continuous systems stop contamination. So if you've got a pipe, and in the bottom of that pipe you have a yeast sediment, and you're pumping your mead slowly through that, all the contaminants will wash out of that yeast bed, and the dominant yeasts that are adapted will stay. And you could throw in 10 or 15 different yeasts and let them fight it out and breed with each other and do whatever they're going to do. And at the end of it, you'll have a yeast which is adapted to mead making. But you'd have to do this for 1 or 2 years. But you could make a fermenter which makes 1 bottle a day.
Right.
And I've chatted to people here that are home mead makers that are making 200-300 gallons a year. It's not going to hurt them to make that over a whole year, rather than making it in a whole lot of batches every weekend.
So did you design your continuous fermenter system?
It was an accident. My supervisor told me I would not get a PhD for a batch fermenter, because he said there's nothing novel about it, and that I should try something else. And so I said, what else is there? And he said, why don't you try a continuous fermenter? They use it to make fuel alcohol and ethanol. I mean, in Mexico, why don't you try using it for mead? And so I went into the lab and I found a couple of things, and I cobbled something together, and it worked. And then from a chemical engineering perspective, we went backwards on it, and it turned out that the ratios and sizes of the pipes and everything we used were within, about 2% of what they should have been. So it was perfect, and it worked, and it was one of those accidents that was just very lucky.
Do you think mead makers are in the future going to be doing this just because it's so efficient and it produces such good yeast?
We've had a couple of people approaching us that are keen to apply the technology. I think what will probably happen is we'll see a lot of people fiddling around with it for the next 2 or 3 years. And we're looking at producing palletized factories, which we would actually just, somebody phones in and says, okay, we want a factory, and we send it out in a container, and they put it together. But, this is a bit like shareware software. The mead industry, there's no capital. Nobody has money. The big meaderies have their own way of making mead, and the people that are entering the market don't. That's our target market, is people that actually don't have any money. So we're not going to be selling that technology easily, because people can't afford to buy it. So what's going to happen is we're probably just going to, once I publish the stuff, we'll make it shareware and open source, so that people can actually just try and get the mead industry going with it.
Wow, so mead making will be kind of the first open source brewing or mead making or any sort of fermenting that ever has existed before.
It'll be probably one of the first times people have invented a new technology and not been too aggressive about trying to make money out of it. For us, it's in our interests. I mean, if there are going to be 1,000 meaderies in the next 10 years, it will benefit our product. Sure. Because you can't have a connoisseur of one brand of mead. You can't be a connoisseur of mass-produced beer. You can be a connoisseur of craft beer. And that is why festivals like this happen, is because we've got connoisseurs that are fascinated by the diversity of mead or beer that has a personality. And it's the person attached to the mead that makes the mead interesting. And if we can get more people out there making mead, it benefits our product, so that's our plan.
Well, let's talk about your product. You brought 3 different ones today did you enter all of these into the competition?
We entered the 3 that we are going to be selling in the States, which are the herbal mead, which is our entry mead. It's easy to like. It's reasonably complex. It's got cinnamon, apple, and rooibos, in addition to a certain amount of desert wildflower and buckwheat honey. And then we've got a dry, which is desert wildflower and citrus, and aged in American oak. We believe strongly in American oak. Medium toast. We don't use French oak because we find that fights with the mead, our mead.
Oh, really?
It may work with other people's mead, but it doesn't work with ours. And then we've got a chili mead, which is my personal non-favorite, but it seems to be very popular. It's the first one that we finished out on, and it's got a slice of habanero in it, and I consider it to be considerably worse than being stung by a bee, and everybody else seems to disagree with me, but I'm a beekeeper and I've been stung 20,000 times. So.
I would love to see Garth's fermentation system, or even just see a diagram of how that thing works.
Yeah, I would too. And with the way he was talking, it sounds like we very well might get that opportunity. I mean, it sounds like he just wants to open it up and let people build their own and make their own modifications and kind of see the industry grow because of that kind of open spirit.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing that we've heard in several places, is people are kind of keeping the walls of competition between the mead makers down, so that they can have a concentrated force to grow the segment. And they know that it's in their best interest to have everybody educated about mead in general, and it doesn't matter who is preaching the message, so to speak.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're all improving our abilities and all improving the mead, then the collective industry and the public, benefits from that. We all get better because of people like Garth and that sort of thing.
Well, cool. Brian, I appreciate very much you being our first stringer, our first man in the field for Basic Brewing Radio, and you did an excellent job. And
well, thanks, James. I had a blast, and thanks for kind of opening up this opportunity. It was really cool, and my wife, who helped me with all of this, she had a blast too. So it was fun for us both to kind of share that experience.
Well, great. And you've got something cooking for a future episode of Basic Brewing Radio that may shake some trees, may shake some people's conceptions about. Shall we say the topic?
Well, I don't know.
Just
some
as
of your
a teaser,
listeners who might remember the blind mice episode from, I guess it was early November that it went out, might know this topic. we might be, and I can't really say what the results of this will be yet, but the hot side aeration topic might get a little bit of publicity in the future.
So maybe we'll just leave it at that. We'll leave a little teaser out there. But Brian, again, thank you very much for your help, and we'll hear from you soon.
Thanks, James. It was a pleasure, and I'd be glad to go to this festival for you anytime.
You can find a link to pictures that Brian took at the Mead Festival in the description of this week's show at basicbrewingradio.com. You can also find links to the meaderies that we talked about as well. And once again, great job, Brian. Thanks a lot. I'm not sure what we'll have next week. I'm working on a couple of things, but I'm sure whatever we'll have will be outstanding. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And if you're wanting to get into homebrewing for the first time, while you're on our site, you can check out our DVD, Basic Brewing, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing. We'll walk you through the process step by step, and you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVD. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it from us directly online. And, by the way, the all-grain DVD is in the capable hands of the Replicator, so stay tuned for the production version of that as well. But that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.